The mayor of Athens said it out loud, not a protester, not an academic, not an opposition politician looking for a headline. The mayor of the city that invented Western civilization stood up in 2025 and told the world that Athens cannot go on functioning as a giant hotel. That was the phrase he used, a giant hotel. And the reason he used it was because he was watching his city transform, district by district, neighborhood by neighborhood, into exactly that, a city that exists to be visited and has stopped being a city that can be lived in. 8 million tourists arrived in Athens in 2025. 8 million. In a metropolitan area of around 4 million people. 2 visitors for every resident, arriving in a city whose infrastructure, whose housing stock, whose historic centre was never designed to absorb that kind of pressure, and is now visibly breaking under it. In the narrow lanes of Plaka, the ancient neighbourhood that crowds itself around the base of the Acropolis, the number of short-stay rental nights has more than doubled since 2018. Doubled. In a neighbourhood that was already saturated before the boom began. And across Athens as a whole, roughly 150,000 properties have been converted from residential use to tourist rental. 150,000 homes that used to house Athenians, and now house visitors on 4-night breaks, who will never know the name of the person who used to live there. The result? Between 2019 and 2024, rents in Athens rose by more than 50%. 50% in 5 years. In a country still recovering from a sovereign debt crisis that shrank the economy by a quarter. In a city where the median income leaves almost no room for a rent increase of any size. And in a housing market now estimated to be short by 180,000 units. 180,000 homes that simply do not exist in a form that ordinary Athenians can access, because too many of them have been absorbed into the tourism machine. This is the story nobody tells when they celebrate the Greek tourism renaissance. Today, Behind the Facade is going to tell it. Before we go further, if you are watching this video, you are watching something that took serious work to produce. Behind the Facade is a brand new channel. Every investigation we make costs real research time and real production effort. We are not backed by a network, a team, or an algorithm yet. The only thing that puts us in front of people who need to hear these stories is you subscribing. Right now. If you hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell, you tell YouTube's algorithm that this content is worth recommending. And for a small channel like ours, that is everything. It costs you 3 seconds. For us, it is the difference between growing and disappearing. Subscribe, and let's get into it. To understand how Athens ended up here, you need to understand what Athens was before the tourism boom began. Greece's capital is one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities. It is also one of Europe's youngest modern capitals. A city that was a small Ottoman town of fewer than 10,000 people when it was named the capital of the newly independent Greek state in 1834. What followed was nearly 2 centuries of rapid, chaotic, and largely unplanned growth. Waves of refugees from Asia Minor, internal migration from rural Greece, post-war construction that built densely and cheaply across the Attica Basin, a middle-class expansion in the 1960s and 1970s that filled the city's concrete apartment blocks with families who believed they had found something approaching stability. And then the long, grinding crisis of 2010 to 2018 that stripped many of those same families of the stability they thought they had. The crisis decade was the hinge. Between 2010 and 2018, the Greek economy contracted by more than 25%, a peacetime economic collapse without precedent in modern European history. Unemployment peaked above 27%. Youth unemployment exceeded 60% at its worst. Property values collapsed. The population of central Athens, already in decline, accelerated its fall as people left for work in Germany, the Netherlands, Britain, or simply retreated from the increasingly expensive city to cheaper outer districts and satellite towns. And into that hollowed-out centre, the apartments left empty by emigration and crisis, the properties whose owners had stopped paying maintenance fees, the neighbourhoods that had lost their economic pulse, came the platforms. Airbnb arrived in Greece in 2012 and grew slowly through the crisis years, offering property owners a way to generate income from assets that the long-term rental market could no longer support. Then, as Greece's tourism recovery accelerated from 2018 onward, the growth became explosive. Rents on short-term platforms in central Athens and the surrounding tourist districts began generating returns that no long-term residential lease could match. Property owners made the calculation that any rational economic actor would make, and one by one, the homes of the centre were converted into something else. The neighbourhoods that were hollowed out by the crisis were not refilled with residents, they were refilled with tourists. The crisis cleared the ground. The tourism boom built something new on it, Something that looks, from the outside, like revival, like restoration, like the city coming back to life. It is not coming back to life. It is being converted. And the conversion is now so far advanced in the historic centre that the people who are supposed to live in that city, the teachers, the nurses, the civil servants, the young couples, the families with children, are finding that there is simply nowhere left for them. Let us go to Plaka first, because Plaka is where the contradiction is most visible, most complete, and most irreversible. Plaka is the neighbourhood that sits at the foot of the Acropolis, the oldest continuously inhabited area in Athens, a place of winding pedestrians, neoclassical houses, Byzantine churches, and the kind of layered historical density that no other European city outside Rome or Istanbul can quite match. It is also, today, the most heavily converted neighbourhood in the Attica Basin. The short-stay rental density in Plaka is among the highest recorded anywhere in southern Europe. There are streets in Plaka where every property on the block, ground floor, first floor, second floor, has been converted to tourist accommodation. Streets where the concept of a neighbour no longer exists because the person who was your neighbour last week has been replaced by someone from Amsterdam or Tokyo who leaves on Sunday. The resident population of Plaka has been declining for decades. It was always a small, tight, residentially dense neighbourhood, and the pressure of tourism was already noticeable before 2018. But the pace of conversion since the short-term rental explosion has accelerated that decline to a pace that planners are now openly describing as irreversible under current conditions. The last remaining residents, mostly elderly people who own their properties outright and have nowhere to go, describe a neighbourhood that has become unrecognisable. The pharmacy is gone. The neighbourhood butcher is gone. The local Cafe Neon, where people used to sit for hours playing tavli, is gone. What has replaced them are souvenir shops, overpriced restaurants with English-language menus, and the locked doors of tourist apartments that cycle through a new occupant every 3 days. The Acropolis is still there, of course. The ancient ruins are unchanged. But the living city that was supposed to surround and support and give meaning to those ruins, the city of ordinary people going about their ordinary lives in the shadow of an extraordinary history, is disappearing from the centre. And what is left behind is not a city, it is a backdrop. The numbers behind this transformation are both precise and damning. Approximately 150,000 properties across Greece have been registered as short-term tourist rentals. In Athens alone, the concentration of these properties in the central districts, Plaka, Monastiraki, Kokaki, Syri, Exarchia, has created what housing economists describe as a displacement cascade. As tourist rentals drive up market prices in the most desirable central locations, residents who cannot afford the new market rates move to the next ring of neighbourhoods. Their arrival there drives up prices in those neighbourhoods too. And the families who were already in those second-ring neighbourhoods move further out, toward the periphery, toward the commuter towns, toward the hour-long journey to a job that is still in the centre. The cascade has a speed. Between 2019 and 2024, rents across metropolitan Athens rose by over 50%. The percentage is significant, but the absolute numbers are what make it devastating in Greek terms. A 2-bedroom apartment in Kokaki, a neighbourhood south of the Acropolis that was considered affordable working-class territory as recently as 2017, now commands rents of €1,000 a month or more. The average monthly salary in Greece remains around €1,100 net. For a young couple, both working full-time, paying €1,000 a month in rent leaves a margin for everything else that is not compatible with any reasonable definition of normal life. And that is, if you can find the apartment at all, because the shortage of 180,000 residential units means that the competition for every available long-term lease is intense enough that landlords can, and routinely do, demand prepayments of 3 to 6 months up front. 3 to 6 months of rent in advance from people earning Greek salaries. The math does not work. The math cannot work. And yet the platform listings for the same property as a tourist rental fill up months in advance. This is not a natural market dynamic. This is the result of a regulatory environment that, for years, treated the short-term rental sector as a source of economic recovery rather than as a competitor to the housing market. Greek government policy after the crisis encouraged the platformization of residential property as a way to generate income, tax revenue, and tourist spending in a devastated economy. The platforms offered a lifeline to property owners who had watched their asset values collapse during the debt crisis. The state benefited from the tourist spending multiplier. The tourist arrivals numbers went up, the GDP contribution from tourism grew, and the people who needed to rent homes found that the homes were no longer available, or were available only at prices that had been calibrated to compete with what a tourist would pay for 4 nights, not what a resident could afford for 12 months. By the time the Greek government began introducing restrictions, a 2024 regulation imposing tighter registration requirements and a maximum of 90 days annual rental for urban residential properties, the conversion wave had already reshaped the housing landscape of central Athens in ways that a registration cap cannot undo. The properties are already converted, the residents are already displaced, the supply has already shrunk, and a 90-day cap, even if perfectly enforced, which it is not, does not return a converted tourist apartment to the residential market overnight. The mayor's words hang over the city's future like an unanswered question. A giant hotel. He meant it as a warning, but it is also already a description. Move beyond the tourist core, beyond Plaka and Monastiraki, and the immediate shadow of the Acropolis. And you find the second crisis, the neighborhoods that were the city's residential middle ground and are now caught between the tourist pressure pushing in from the center and the affordability pressure pushing out from it. Petrolona, Neos Kosmos, Pangrati. Exarchia, famously the anarchist district that has spent decades resisting gentrification and is now experiencing a version of it that political resistance cannot stop because it arrives not through police action but through market rates. These neighborhoods were, until very recently, the places where Athens's middle class and creative class lived. The artists, the young professionals, the university lecturers, the civil servants who could not afford Kolonaki but also did not want to commute from the outer suburbs. They are the neighborhoods that gave the city its texture, its contradiction, its street life, its politics, its culture. They are the neighborhoods where rents have risen fastest in percentage terms, precisely because they were the most affordable ring around the tourist core and therefore absorbed the demand that the tourist core had already priced out. And the people being displaced from them, the artists, the young professionals, the teachers, the civil servants, are not being displaced into some other version of urban Athens. They are being displaced out of urban Athens entirely, into commuter towns where the only thing connecting them to their jobs and their lives in the city is a metro line that is already overcrowded. The cultural consequence of this displacement is something that no housing statistic can fully capture. Cities are not just collections of buildings and jobs. They are the accumulation of generations of people living in proximity, building relationships, generating culture, sustaining the invisible infrastructure of everyday community that makes urban life something more than an economic transaction. Athens, specifically, has a density of cultural and intellectual life, the kapheneon culture, the political tradition, the neighborhood identity, the particular kind of urban sociality that Greeks call kefi, that is dependent on mixed, affordable, residentially stable neighborhoods. When those neighborhoods are progressively converted to tourist accommodation and their residents progressively pushed to the periphery, that culture does not simply relocate. It disperses. It thins. It gradually stops being reproduced. The fear, expressed openly by urban planners and cultural commentators and the mayor himself, is that Athens is moving toward a version of the Venetian model. Not the dramatic, sudden collapse, but the slow, market-driven, politically facilitated evacuation of a historic city centre, leaving behind something that looks like Athens but no longer functions as one. The Acropolis will still be there, the Parthenon will still be photographed by 8 million people a year, but the city that gave meaning to those monuments, the living, breathing, arguing, cooking, politicizing, complaining, deeply human city underneath, will have been converted into a hotel lobby for people who arrived on Thursday and leave on Monday and never knew it was something else. The mayor's phrase, the giant hotel, captures something that housing statistics and rental platform data cannot. It captures the existential insult of it. The idea that a city that survived the Persian invasion and the Ottoman Empire and a 25% economic collapse in living memory is now being converted, not by force but by economics, into a transient space for other people's holidays. That the Athenians who rebuilt their city after the crisis, who stayed when half their generation left for Germany, who maintained the fabric of ordinary life through years of austerity and uncertainty, that those people are now being told, by the invisible mechanism of market rates, that they can no longer afford to live in the city they refuse to abandon. This is the housing trap the title of this video refers to. It is not a trap in the sense of a scheme or a conspiracy. It is a trap in the structural sense. A situation in which the forces that are displacing people from the city are the same forces that are making the city economically viable, so that no simple policy response can address the displacement without threatening the economic engine that the country desperately needs. Athens cannot simply turn off tourism. Greece's economy is 30% dependent on it. The revenues that fund the public sector, the hospitals, the schools, the social safety net that kept people alive during the crisis, a significant portion of them flow through the tourist economy. The city cannot reject what is killing it, because what is killing it is also keeping it alive. That is the trap. And it is a trap that other cities, Barcelona, Lisbon, Amsterdam, Venice, have discovered, each in their own way, without finding an exit that fully works. The restrictions help at the margin. The registration caps reduce some of the acceleration. The tourist taxes generate revenue for housing programs that cannot be built fast enough. But none of these measures, individually or in combination, has managed to reverse a housing displacement crisis once it has reached the scale that Athens is now experiencing. What Athens needs, and what its mayor is implicitly calling for when he uses the phrase giant hotel, is a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between tourism and urban residency, a decision, politically and economically explicit, about what kind of city Athens is going to be and for whom. That decision involves trade-offs that nobody in Greece's political class is yet fully willing to articulate: slower tourism growth in exchange for housing stability, reduced platform conversion in exchange for a functional residential market, less tourist spending in exchange for a city that its residents can actually afford to live in. The alternative, the path of no decision, of continued conversion, of managed decline, is already visible in the streets of Plaka, in the closed pharmacies of neighborhoods that used to have them, in the young Athenians paying 60% of their income in rent or commuting 90 minutes each way from the outer suburbs. The alternative to choosing what Athens will be is watching it become what the market is already turning it into: a magnificent, historically layered, extraordinarily photogenic giant hotel. One that happens to have a metro system and a few remaining residents who remember when it was something else. Athens built the Parthenon. It invented democracy. It gave the Western world its vocabulary of politics, philosophy, and architecture. It survived things that should have ended it multiple times. Whether it can survive being converted into a tourist product, that is the question it is now living inside. And the answer is not written yet. But the window to write it is closing, one Airbnb listing at a time. Subscribe if this kind of investigation matters to you, and tell us in the comments. Do you think Athens can avoid the fate of Venice, or is the conversion already too far gone?